I tried to go way out of my way to make absolutely clear in that essay and, in everything else I say that I'm not a fan of Donald Trump or his foreign policy. But some of the questions that he's putting on the table do need to be dealt with.
This is Thanassis Cambanis. Welcome to episode 19 of TCF's World Podcast. I'm joined by Paul Staniland, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, and we're going to be talking about liberal alternatives to Trump's foreign policy, and more broadly about the unfolding debate about the history of the international liberal order. Paul, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So you recently wrote a piece called Misreading the Liberal Order, Why We Need New Thinking in American Foreign Policy. And I want to start with the basics because it's actually a useful chance for all of us to get a little bit of a primer. And I think this is also the foundations of the debate that's unfolding. Just define for us what is the international liberal order?
Well, that I think is actually a really important question, and it's not one that I think there's an agreed upon answer to. So that was part of the motivation for my piece, as I was reading articles that were talking about how Trump threatened the liberal order or the liberal international order. And it wasn't always clear what that meant exactly. I think it is often used to refer to the promotion of international institutions, the promotion of political liberalism, so democracy and human rights, and some degree of economic openness. So, for instance, free trade and international institutions that can facilitate kind of economic liberalism as well as political liberalism. The tricky thing, though, is I think there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly any of those pillars of the liberal order mean. So, like, what counts as advancing political liberalism, for instance? But also there's disagreement about the extent of the liberal order. So was there a liberal order is there now a liberal order around most of the globe? Is it confined to particular regions? How has it evolved over time? And so I think the idea of liberal order is a really interesting and important one, but it can be really fuzzy. And so that was kind of one of the motivations, is it's not clear we know exactly what this thing is. But it has something to do with economic liberalism, something to do with political liberalism, and something to do with international institutions, multilateral institutions.
And this is something that became a lot more clear to people, or around which a lot more consensus emerged the second they felt it was under attack by Donald Trump. And I guess if we had this conversation a few years ago, self-identified liberals might have been a lot more openly fractious about what they think the international liberal order is, or whether they think we're actually living through one. So I mean, one of the facets of this, the sort of debate within liberal circles and I mean, I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean, classic liberal circles in the wake of Trump, is whether we were enjoying some kind of consensus international liberal order before Trump came to office in the first place. And I want to hear your take on whether that sort of fuzzy consensus of free trade, grudging respect for international institutions and the UN, and a sort of default of arbitrating international disputes through institutions, although not a sort of uniform practice. Was that actually a thing, a bipartisan consensus set of values and practices in the foreign policy sphere?
So I think there are different answers that one could give to that. So other people in this debate would offer a different answer than me. I think it's fair to say there was something like a liberal order kind of centered around the North Atlantic. So this overlap of NATO, or partial overlap of NATO, the EU, the World Trade Organization. Maybe you could throw the United Nations in there. But I think, you could argue that Western Europe into parts of Eastern Europe, the North America had something like a liberal order. And then other parts of the world had parts of that. So East Asia, for instance, ends up with a lot of free trade and kind of economic liberalism, but without robust international institutions around security, for instance. Other parts of the world, I find it hard to find much of the liberal order, right? So the Middle East, large parts of South Asia, historically, Africa, Latin America, at least my argument would be, sure, there are elements of something that we might think was a liberal order in these places, But a lot of the politics, including a lot of U.S. foreign policy, didn't really involve kind of these pillars of the order. So my intervention was to say, look, there may have been something like this that existed in some parts of the world in some historical periods. That's important. That's fine. But in a lot of the rest of the world, this just wasn't really how politics were structured, and it wasn't really what drove American foreign policy.
And I mean, the reason why this matters is because if we're figuring out what America's posture should be in the world, it's important to understand what we were doing up until now, and whether what we were doing really tracked well with what we said we were doing. And there seems to be a lot of, I mean, some sincere hand wringing, some revisionism around this question when we look at the post-war period. And I guess we have to be careful not to get too esoteric in breaking down the different phases of the post-World War II order. But I think there's some really important core questions at the heart of this. And one is, did America consistently use its power and strength to extend a security umbrella over big chunks of the world? And did it use its influence to police somewhat equitable economic rules around the rich world in a way that wasn't solely about promoting America's short-term self-interest? Because I think that's the core of what, was America doing something that was good for a wider realm of stakeholders, or was it just pursuing its self-interest in a way that happened for a short period of time to coincide with some nice seeming values?
Right. I mean, I'm not an expert on the international economic side, so I can say a few things about that, but I don't want to get out over my skis on that. I would say that in some parts of the world, the U.S. did extend a security umbrella that involved these pillars of the liberal order, promoting democracy, institution building. In other parts of the world, there was an American security umbrella, but it was not a particularly pleasant one for a lot of people involved, right? So the U.S. has been closely allied with the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, for instance. That, created a particular kind of order, or with the Shah before the late 1970s. In Southeast Asia and East Asia, there was close alignment with often authoritarian leaders who were anti-communist. So the U.S. had a big security footprint all around the world. The implications of that for actual liberalism or the liberal order, I think, varied dramatically. So rebuilding Japan as a democracy is good, but being involved in very nasty, or at least being complicit in really nasty human rights abuses committed by authoritarian allies, I think is not compatible with this kind of hard version of the liberal order that some of its advocates seem to be putting out there, or at least at times seem to have been putting out there.
Well, and you, I think you made a tangential comment about this in your essay, but I thought it was very on point. You said, if I recall correctly, that a lot of the defenders of this supposedly great rosy history of the international liberal order ignore long, crucial, sordid chapters like the war in Vietnam or the war in Iraq when they talk about what supposedly came before Trump. And I want you to unpack that a little bit. And I mean, so to the extent that there was some kind of coherent or consistent body of American ways of being out in the world, what's the more accurate way to understand it with its warts? If it's the America that helped promote the EU or the Marshall Plan or the reconstruction of Japan, but also the America that helped promote a lot of destructive open-ended wars that ended up not really helping any of America's core interests.
Right. I mean, I guess so. First, let me say I think there are three ways that advocates of the liberal order deal with some of the unpleasantness, let's put it that way. One is just not to talk about it. Another is to say mistakes were made, but usually that's maybe a paragraph in an article. It's to say, of course, there were mistakes, but basically things were good. A third is to try to de-link the liberal order from the bad stuff and to say, look, these were just different aims, different policies. We can't judge the liberal order by this other stuff because it wasn't linked to the liberal order. So those are kind of the three rhetorical moves I've seen. I think the tricky thing there is, or at least the way I think about it, is there are very few policies that don't have trade-offs. And what I think kind of analysts of American foreign policy or of, politics in general just need to have their eyes open about what some of the policies, how they can have two sides of of a coin. So an interesting example is the US is deeply involved in rebuilding Europe after World War II, which is great, right? But in order to do that, they need to get French cooperation. So what does that mean? Well, in the mid-1940s into the late 1940s, we end up helping the French kind of get their empire back together and help support the war in Indochina. Even though there are a lot of Americans, or at least some Americans, who are saying, this seems like a really bad idea. But in order to kind of build the liberal order in the core, we end up helping to try to support the French Empire on the periphery. So both of those things are true, that we did some really great things, but also linked to that were some things that I think are much more problematic. And I think to take seriously the history of American foreign relations, but especially America in the developing world, which is really much more my focus. I don't study NATO. I study South Asia, a little bit of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. We just need to keep in mind that there are these trade-offs. There is this complexity, and we can't just kind of write that out of history.
And I mean, there's a left critique that, in my view, sometimes simplistically boils down a left foreign policy to being simply anti-war rather than pro-war, but it raises I think a useful corrective question, which is is it possible that these sort of institution building or crusading liberal values that undergirded a lot of the post-World War II emerging order in fact do lend themselves or almost depend on imperialist projects or in a way authoritarian bargains in places on the periphery, so that maybe some of these dirty spots on the record are actually inseparable from the context of a liberal policy. I'm wondering if you see any substance to that.
I think sometimes that's I think that's true sometimes, right? I'm not going to say it's always true or it's never true, but an interesting example going back to Saudi Arabia is if you want a Europe that's growing fast, that's reconstructing, that's economically developing, you need oil, right? And well, where do you get oil from? You end up looking to the Middle East, right? And the Saudi regime and a variety of others. And so in some senses, there are certainly cases where these are inseparable. Now, that doesn't mean they're always inseparable, and that whenever something good is happening in the kind of liberal order, we need to go find an equivalent evil that's occurring in the developing world. I think that's not the right analytical impulse. But when there is this connection, I think we just need to be open with ourselves about it, right? And I think that can be difficult, right? Because it introduces a lot of complexity, both kind of moral and historical complexity. And it doesn't lend itself that easily to kind of big slogans. Defend the liberal order, for instance. Well, the liberal order existed in some places at some times and not at others. And there were parts of it in some places. And there were some really good things about it. But also there were some dark sides and ambiguities. And that's just part of the history of, American foreign policy. But to make policy now, I think we need to have like a full spectrum understanding of what happened before, and not a simple history of it. Let's put it that way.
Right, and Trumpism has, in some ways, allowed people to elide these issues, and by calling into question the very ideas of international cooperation or of the utility of international regimes. I think it's given it's at least opened the door for people to take a free pass of dealing with these things in their full complexity.
Order from Ashes, New Foundations for Security in the Middle East is a multi-year TCF project supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. TCF experts are studying new ways to manage conflict and promote stability. You can order the book and read the reports on our website. Go to tcf.org and look for the Arab Regional Security page.
This is Thanassis Cambanis. I'm talking with Paul Staniland from the University of Chicago. He's a political scientist who's weighed in on the emerging debate over the international liberal order and what a better liberal foreign policy would look like. Let's sort of shift our conversation a little bit towards the debate that's unfolding now and why all this matters looking forward as we try and come up with better foreign policy ideas. Why is it so important to nail down this historical question at this moment in time?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the way I've thought about this, and I'm not a policymaker. I don't work at a think tank. I'll never be in the government, right? So I think my job is to kind of get the issues out there, right? I
never say never.
I'm pretty comfortable saying never, but you never know. I think to make good strategy, you need to know what your choices are, and you need to know what choices have been made in the past and what worked and what didn't work, right? And so that means kind of looking at the full set of choices that were made and trying to weigh in some intellectually serious way, what went well and what didn't. Right. So an issue that comes to mind, just as an example, is the promotion of democracy and human rights. And so on the one hand, we want to promote those things. And there's both a left-wing case for doing that and a right-wing case for doing that, though they're different. You can make them. On the other hand, the history of American foreign policy shows enormous variation in how democratization and human rights are actually dealt with. Right. And so rather than saying we should always do this or never do this, I think it's important to say, well, okay, when did promoting human rights and democracy have positive impact? When did it have negative impacts? When did it take a really long time but was worth it? When did it take a really long time and it didn't really work out and we just ended up kind of supporting authoritarian regimes that claimed they were getting better? So in order to make some kind of policy call about human rights and democratization, right, or about when to use military force abroad or the ups and downs of alliances, I think it's just important to know what has and hasn't worked in the past, rather than ending up with slogans that say alliances are the best, we always need them, or alliances are always entangling and will get the U.S. in trouble wherever they are, right? Which would be kind of a particular libertarian far right / parts of the far left critique of alliances. So I think it's important to look at variation. That's how I think in terms of social sciences, like what happened, how did it vary, what can help us understand what led to better outcomes and worse outcomes.
And in the context of today, I mean, I think there's a sort of resurgent isolationist view that, you just described as the critique of all alliances being entangling. And I think there's a claim now being put forward by some serious people or, powerful people anyway, that the entire premise of depending on other entities out in the world is a bad approach for the United States, and I guess the question about the historical record is one, have we ever really embedded ourselves in these international regimes? Have we ever really subordinated ourselves to an international regime or arbitration or other entity, and then if we have, or to the extent that we have, how has that worked out for the U.S. And I mean the other piece of this that I think is interesting as a policy analyst is that I get the impression that foreign policy experts are very uncomfortable with some of Trump's questions, and yet some of those questions are worth answering. I mean, one can, I think, make a good case for NATO, but one ought to make the case rather than require it to be an assumption that NATO is good. If these are strong ideas, there should be strong arguments that one can muster on their behalf. And I guess it hasn't been a debate until now for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's been this kind of horrified reaction, and I tried to go way out of my way to make absolutely clear in that essay and and everything else I say that I'm not a fan of Donald Trump or his foreign policy. But some of the questions that he's putting on the table do need to be dealt with, right? We're kind of sitting in this world where a lot of the institutions and a lot of the security arrangements the U.S. has built are legacies either of the Cold War or of kind of the 9/11 moment. And it's not obvious that all of those need to kind of continue in perpetuity. Now, I think plenty of them can be justified in strong terms, just like you said about NATO. I'm not one who would, want to leave Europe. But, if there are issues with NATO, they need to be addressed. And I think Trump's great skill, but also his incredible weakness is he's able to raise these questions, right? But because he's the one doing it, the way he does it and his clear kind of endless lies and bad faith make it really hard to have a conversation about it that doesn't end up either lending aid and support to Donald Trump or rejecting Donald Trump and all of his works, right? So it gets really tricky to kind of have some of these debates. I think a really interesting one is trade. And I'm not a trade scholar, so I'm just going to kind of put it out there that there used to be big debates about the Washington Consensus, about neoliberalism, about, when is trade good or bad? And there's been a resurgence of a lot of that interest since the Trump election because of the effects of trade on, parts of the American Rust Belt, for instance. But on the left, there doesn't seem to be the same kind of ferment around trade that there was maybe 20 years ago, right? I remember the Battle of Seattle around the WTO. So that's, those are some of the issues where you'd want to see both resistance to what Trump is doing, but also a new conversation kind of within anti-Trump forces. And sometimes that latter conversation gets drowned out.
And you're overtly trying to be part of that conversation. I mean, that's what you say right at the end of this essay. And I mean, your essay comes at a time where I think up on my screen I have like 10 or 15 essays by people who are to some extent internationalists who are debating what this should look like. So you end with that question, like what should breaking from what you call the intellectual inertia, what should a good foreign policy look like? So let's hear your thoughts about that conversation. So what should it look like?
Yeah. Well, so I'm not going to I don't have a perfectly worked out American foreign policy, but let me tell you what I think you'd want to have debates about, right? And I have views on any number of these things, but I think it's more useful to lay out kind of what we want to be arguing about. One is how important should human rights be in American foreign policy, right? So we're looking right now at the war in Yemen, links with Saudi Arabia, this ambivalent alliance with Turkey, links to Myanmar, Thailand. Should human rights be a bigger issue or not in a non-Trump foreign policy, right? Democratization, similarly. How should democratization be pursued if we want to pursue democratization? What are the most important strategies, most effective strategies? What are things to avoid, right? International institutions, what makes them work well and what doesn't, right? So right now the EU, which, generally I'm a fan of the EU, but it has major, major problems. How could those have been avoided? If so, how, right? Similarly with how the UN works or the World Trade Organization. Something I'm not qualified to really discuss, but that's hugely important, is the trade regime, both at home and abroad. How do we deal with globalization and its impacts, okay? The use of military force. I think there's a lot of all good things go together thinking that you could see in the foreign policy kind of advocates for the liberal order, right? But sometimes you need to use military force in ways that undercut liberalism or that even undercut order, or at least sometimes you use military force in that way. Alliances we've talked about. And then something I just want to kind of throw in here is the national security state at home. How robust a security state do we want? And this links into questions about homeland security. Now, there are different answers you can give to all of those questions, but what I don't like is when everybody lumps them together and says, we can get all the good things we want. Often there are trade-offs across these, right? If you want strong alliances, you may need to deprioritize human rights and democratization if we're talking about a country like Thailand or Vietnam or Pakistan, right? If you want to promote human rights, well, then maybe you're going to have to kind of downgrade some allies. And so these are the kind of trade-offs I think that need to be grappled with in a really kind of open way and not treated as things that can be easily solved as long as we get Donald Trump out of office. Because these issues are going to be with us even if Trump disappears tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think these issues have been the Achilles heel of U.S. foreign policy for sure since 9/11 and the swelling of the national security state. And I think these are questions that liberals especially have trouble grappling with openly. And from that sort of list of important things you mentioned, a couple jump out at me as at the core to me as lying at the core of the sort of paralysis, and they are, how to get past the obsession with zero risk national security and the huge security state, and how do you deal with the need to use military force sometimes in international affairs without reducing it to a sort of simple, anti-war or all-war approach. And I think liberals have a lot of trouble with that because they want to be anti-war, but they want to be tough on terror, and they don't want to sound like they're apologists for the European Union or for these international institutions that are or the UN that are somehow viewed as being inimical to U.S. interests rather than being understood as a platform through which the U.S., like other powers, can pursue its interests. Do you see a new willingness to take these kinds of questions head on among whether it's intellectuals or sort of policy people directly involved in the policy process?
I mean, I think it's been really interesting to see this debate develop, and it's suggestive that there's room out there to have these conversations. I think maybe some of the initial pushback on Trump took this fairly totalizing attitude, right? You read these foreign affairs articles about, how the liberal order will survive or why Trump threatens the liberal order, and you read them and think like this doesn't jive with at least my understanding of post-1945 history. And maybe once the initial shock of Trump wears off a little bit, and also, non-Trump forces maybe take the House or maybe win the election in 2020, people are going to need to have these hard conversations, right? I mean, terrorism, I think, is this really important issue. How risk tolerant or risk acceptant are we? How involved in the Middle East do we need to be? If we're going to be involved in the Middle East, well, does that mean we need to get in bed with really nasty regimes that can do the things we want them to do? The rise of China, similarly, how are we going to build institutions? Do we need to build institutions in Asia? If we do, how do we do it? If we want to counterbalance China, how much tolerance for non-democratic allies or partners, like, for instance, Vietnam comes to mind, or Duterte in the Philippines, are we going to have? And so these are trade-offs that I think the world is going to force on us, and they're conversations that are going to happen regardless of whether Trump is in office or not. Obviously, they'll have a very different tenor depending on whether he's still the president. But at a certain point, we have to have these conversations, or else it's going to be kind of the same old, fairly platitudinous conversations again and again.
What do you think is the sort of hardest of these to resolve? I mean, and when I look at this sort of laundry list, I think, okay, questions like human rights and democratization, at the end of the day, like almost no one in practice ever is willing to sacrifice a hard interest in favor of human rights or democracy. But in a lot of cases, there's a much less. There's a much harder kind of trade-off to face, like letting. Ceding a sphere of influence to Russia in the Middle East, or watching China extend its economic and military power into parts of Southeast Asia that had hitherto been U.S. areas, and in those cases, it's again a hard question, because someone can reasonably say, so what? What do we really lose? What do we really need to be spending billions and taking risk in order to assert ourselves there? How do we start to weigh those kinds of issues of changing the American footprint in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I see four big, tricky dilemmas, right? And that's kind of the question I take from you. It's like, so what are the really big dilemmas we face? I'll just mention the first two. They're not things I study much, but one is how to deal with the domestic political impacts of globalization, flows of people, flows of goods, right? The second, we've talked about the national security state. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think we need to have that conversation as a country. What kind of information about us do we want to be gathered by the state? And what can the state do with it? And then the two others, I think, right? One is dealing with the rise of China in a way that maintains some degree of American influence and prevents a Chinese hegemony in East Asia, right? Which has been a goal of American foreign policy, for decades and decades, without getting entangled or caught in the escalatory spirals that could lead to a war that would be really, really bad for everybody involved. Right? So I think that's a really hard question. And I think it's one that there's actually been some really interesting debate about whether the U.S. got it wrong. There was this Ellie Ratner and Kurt Campbell piece in Foreign Affairs, and then some very thoughtful responses to it. But that's a huge dilemma. I think that's the fundamental dilemma of the next couple of decades, is dealing with the rise of China. The second you already brought up is what tolerance for risk do we have when it comes to terrorism? Because again, there's this trade-off. If you aren't paying enough attention, you could end up with politically incendiary and obviously, brutal and violent terrorist attacks. Too much involvement, though, we've seen can also have really perverse effects as well. And so trying to find some kind of rough balance of how much risk we're willing to take versus how much intervention we're willing to engage in these parts of the world that have an Al-Qaeda or ISIS presence, I think is another really big dilemma and a really important conversation. The tricky thing with that last one is nobody wants to be soft on terrorism or to be the person on whose watch a terrorist attack occurs. So there's this domestic politics that makes the policy debate really kind of hard to resolve in a purely analytical way.
The politics are very counterproductive on that question, absolutely. And I think our experiences recently in Syria and Afghanistan especially show that we actually really need extensive international cooperation to police terrorism problems, but then no one wants to share credit that way. So no one wants to say, actually, the most effective things we've done to manage this problem have been tedious, cooperative strategies and tactics that have been set up with 20 other countries and multiple institutions. No one wants to talk about that, so they prefer to envision it all being in the same sort of rubric as the killing of Osama bin Laden and the sort of heroic military or drone strike approach, and that I think that discrepancy sort of traps a lot of countries, not just the United States, in this security dilemma, which I don't really see an obvious way out of, but I don't see as an effective long-term solution either. Well, so in closing, given this nice public debate that's broken out, what do you think is the next step in to the extent it exists in international liberal circles to tackle the questions that have been raised by this back and forth over whether the liberal order was a fiction in the first place, and to the extent that it wasn't, what we should salvage from it?
Right. I mean, so I don't go as far as some of the other critics in saying this was all kind of a big fiction, right? I just think it was much more limited and much more ambiguous than some of its advocates suggest. I think the big next step is to define and kind of measure the liberal order. What was this thing? Where was it? What good things occurred as a result of it, and what didn't, right? And then let's look at the non-liberal order parts of the world and parts of U.S. foreign policy, or the places where the liberal order kind of unevenly penetrated. And what were the effective policies there from the U.S. perspective, but also from kind of a broader perspective as well? And what didn't work so well? So I think the first step, and I think maybe we're moving toward that, is a clear definition of what this thing is. So it stops becoming this kind of encompassing catch-all phrase for things we like that were good for America, versus the things that weren't the liberal order, which were things that we didn't like and or were bad for America. I think once we move past that kind of conflation, it'll be a lot easier to just have a much more serious conversation about particular policies, particular regions of the world, particular interpretations of history. So first, you've got to get the definition right, not in a consensus way, but in like a better way than it is now. And then I think it's possible to have this broader discussion moving forward.
Well, thanks so much for your time talking to us today, and thanks very much for your contribution to this very important conversation. Hopefully the next time we have you on this podcast, we'll be able to start answering the question you asked in your essay, which is how to most successfully move beyond the dangerous and mercurial worldview of Donald Trump. This is Thanassis Cambanis. I'm talking with Paul Staniland, a political scientist at the University of Chicago. You can read his essay on Misreading the Liberal Order, Why We Need New Thinking on American Foreign Policy on lawfareblog.com. And you can also see a lot of the articles that we were referencing in our conversation today on the Foreign Affairs website. Thanks for joining us today, and see you on the next episode of TCF World.
TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about the work that TCF does, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.